今天欢迎大家参加今天香港恒生大学显微基金赞助的讲座。我是主持人 James 张老师。今天我们非常荣幸可以邀请到网络上非常红火很多人熟悉的 Professor Jiang 江学勤老师。他是很著名的教育家作家、地缘政治的分析学者他自己也有个频道在 YouTube。叫做 Predictive History， 这样他那个频道呢，吸引了全世界不同国家的人都去看的，所以我也建议，如果你想了解世界更多的话呢，也一定要留意他的 YouTube 那个频道 Predictive History， 他是那个 Predictive History 的主持啦。这样现在刚刚开始，那时候简单介绍一下 Professor Jiang。Professor Jiang 呢，他毕业于耶鲁大学。过去20年呢，他也有一直推动中国的教育改革，然后他出版过2本跟教育有关的书一本叫做《创新中国教育》，另外一本呢就是《看不见的力量》，有关成功、学习跟创造力的真相他出了2本书。然后Professor Jiang 呢，他对国际大事呢，其实他有很深入的研究。如果有了解这段时间他那些研究的话呢，就可以知道他曾经呢提出过3大的预言。第一个就是特朗普他那时候选举那时候呢Professor Jiang 已经讲他呢会再次做总统了。另外第二个呢又是提前很多，他已经可以准确预测呢，就是美国会攻击伊朗。这2个目前呢已经证明呢是很正确的了。他还有了第3个预言，第3个预言呢是美国在这个战争里头他会战败的，像这个我们还要时间去验证今天呢的讲座呢就分2个部分，第一个部分呢就是 Professor Jiang 呢会跟我们讲一个中华文化跟西方文化的对比的演讲。第2部分呢就是我们的提问环节，但是因为我们今天呢除了开放给学校以外呢，也有开放给外面那些公众，所以呢就是你们有问题的话呢，可以把你们的问题呢打在 chat box 里头这样开会前我也收到一些老师跟一些学生他们的问题，这样我也会提问如果有剩下的时间呢，也会回答一些那个参会的人的问题。介绍完了这样讲一下Professor Jiang 今天跟我们讲的题目他演讲的题目就是21世纪的孙子跟苏西底德这样交给你了，可以了吗？
Okay. Thank you, James. Okay.
Thanks.
So I'm very excited to be here for 2 reasons. The first is that it's been a long time since I've had a chance to present in an academic setting. I have been doing a lot of online interviews, but this is the first time in a long time that I've had a chance to talk to scholars. And so I'm really looking forward to a rigorous Q&A after my talk. The second thing is that this is actually the first time in a long time that I've had a chance to reflect on the differences between the Western and Chinese geopolitical outlooks. So thanks to James for the invitation. And so I have a lot to cover, so I'll just get started. And so what I want to discuss are the 3 major differences between the Chinese geopolitical strategic outlook and the Western one. And I will argue that underlying the Western geostrategic mindset is Thucydides, who wrote the Peloponnesian War, which is a war between Athens and Sparta that took place from about 431 BCE to 404 BCE. It was a traumatic war that destroyed the Greek mainland. Underlying the Chinese mindset are 2 books, I think. The first, of course, is Sun Tzu Bingfa, The Art of War by Sun Tzu, but also Sanguo Yanyi, The Romance of the 3 Kingdoms. Okay, so what I want to do now is just look at the differences. I assume that most of you have read both of these books, so I will actually skip over a lot of the content from these 2 books. I assume some of you have read the Peloponnesian War, by Thucydides. If you have not, that's fine. I'll provide you the necessary context information, okay? So my main thesis today is that there are three major differences separating the Chinese and the Western mindset. The first difference is the difference between utility and character, meaning that Chinese tend to see things in a utilitarian perspective. In geopolitics, in IR, we would call this realpolitik or realism. But Thucydides believed that actually nation states, societies, they have a soul, they have a psychology, they have an emotional state, they have a personality. And this is what drives their actions. So trying to perceive things from a purely utilitarian, purely logical, rational perspective doesn't really give you insight into how societies behave. It's much better to look at their outlook, their personality, okay? So that's the first difference. The second difference is that if you read Sang Wen Yi, the Romance of the Three Kingdoms, as well as Students of Bingfa, there are a lot of stratagems in there. But the assumption is that these stratagems work only if people share a similar cultural outlook, which is fine back in ancient China when they were fighting each other. But when you translate this into the international stage, this is problematic because these strategies don't really work if the cultural outlook is different. And so what Thucydides does is rather than look at stratagems, which are not effective actually in warfare, he rather look at speeches, because speeches are a way of revealing the personality and the outlook of a nation, but they also provide guidance, a sort of coordinating mechanism for how people should behave, okay? So that's the second major difference. And the third major difference, and I think this is the most problematic for Chinese to appreciate, is Chinese tend to think that a genius can change history. There's a great man theory of history that's embedded in the Chinese historical outlook. That's not true in Thucydides. He doesn't really care about people. Zhuge Liang, Sima Yi, these people don't really matter. What matters are these larger historical structural forces that drive nation states into certain behavior. All right. So the third is, I think, the hardest to understand. But again, I will try to provide some concrete examples. What I also do is apply these three differences to understanding the U.S.-Iran war, why it started, where it's going. Okay. All right. So let me continue. All right. So the first difference is utility versus character. Again, I assume that most of you are Chinese or have a Chinese background. And so I won't go too much into the Chinese idea of utility. But there are two quotes that help us understand the Chinese mindset, right? So Mao Zedong famously said that political power grows out of the barrel of a gun, right? If you have military power, you have political power. And so therefore, political power must control military power. Okay, that's a very utilitarian way of understanding politics and warfare. But it's actually incorrect, okay? And I'll show you why later on. So second is Deng Xiaoping. It doesn't matter if it's a white cat or a black cat as long as it catches mice. Again, this is wrong. It actually does matter a lot if it's black or white. And again, I'll show you why that's the case later on, okay? So for Thucydides, this is incorrect. So if you just look at a map of the Peloponnesian War, look at Athens and you look at Sparta, what you will see is that in the red is the Athenian alliance, and the blue is the Spartan alliance. And as you can see, their interests don't actually conflict with each other. The Spartans are a agricultural, landlocked nation state, and the Athenians are the seafaring, expansionist naval power. And so for the longest time, they were able to maintain peace. So from a utilitarian perspective, it really didn't make sense for them to go to war. But from Thucydides' perspective, they had to go to war because of their different personalities. So Sparta was conservative, was a conservative oligarchy, whereas Athens was a democracy. And because of their personalities, they would eventually have to come in conflict with each other eventually. Okay, so and this shows us and this gives us insight into why the United States went to war with Iran. Because from a geopolitical perspective, it didn't make sense for the United States to attack Iran. And they could have traded with each other. I mean, Iran offered Donald Trump a great deal, and Trump just refused it, okay? So if you just look at it from a utility perspective, it doesn't really give you insight as to why this war would start. And quite honestly, no one in China, no political expert in China predicted that this war would happen. They all thought it was just negotiation, a lot of flexing, but it would actually start a firefight, okay? So unless you appreciate that, nation states have a certain personality, and that's what leads to conflict. It's very hard to understand how this war started. All right, second difference is the idea of stratagem versus speech. So if you just read Chinese history, there are lots of really famous stratagems, right? So you look at 三国演义, Zhuge Liang has this great stratagem of, he's being outnumbered. So what he does is he just leaves the gate wide open. And then Sima Yi looks at this and he's like, this must be a trap. So he leaves. And this is a very, very famous stratagem from Chinese history. And there are lots of these stratagems, actually. What's odd about about the West is that there's very little stratagems in Western texts. Definitely not any in Thucydides, and very few in other classical texts of the Western tradition as well. Instead, what we have are speeches, okay? So this is the most famous speech from Thucydides. It's called Pericles' Funeral Oration. And what happened is, we're about a war into this devastating war between Athens and Sparta. There are a lot of war dead. And it is a tradition of Athens to hold a funeral oration where the leader, who in this case is Pericles, he explains to the people why we're fighting this war. What is the purpose and where are we going? And this is actually considered the most famous speech in the entire Western tradition. It is something that students study in university very, very carefully. But the point of a speech is that it creates a common identity. So think of like a movie or a newspaper or a national media that gives people a sense of who they are, what they're doing here, and where they're going. And it gives people hope and believe in the future. Okay, so throughout the Peloponnesian War, the book by Thucydides, there are no stratagems, but there are lots and lots of speeches, and these speeches gives you insight into the cultural mentality, the psychology of the people, and ultimately why they're fighting the war. And so this helps us understand how Iran is actually being able to defend itself against the United States. So if you just look at it from purely military perspective, Iran has absolutely no chance of defeating the United States. And so you would logically think that Iran would surrender because the United States has nuclear weapons, it has aircraft carriers. But what the Iranian people have is faith. So the very first act that happened in this war is the Israelis and the Americans bombed Tehran and killed their supreme leader, the Ayatollah Khamenei. And a lot of people were sort of surprised by this because everyone knew the Israelis and the Americans were going to attack. And Moscow and Russia offered sanctuary for the Ayatollah, and he refused. Why? Because he wanted to use his sacrifice as a rallying cry for his people. So even though he didn't really give a speech, his action is a speech in itself in that, this is my home and I will defend my home, even though the odds are completely against me. And you can see how people mourn his death. And this mourning for his death has given them strength and energy and faith in fighting their enemy. And that's why I think that we're seeing such tremendous resistance from the Iranians. Okay, so that's the idea of speech. The last thing I want to talk about is the idea of genius versus structural force. So if you read 三国演义, the Romans of the Three Kingdoms, there are two geniuses in conflict with each other. Okay, they actually don't come in conflict with each other, but they have different perspectives about the world. The first, of course, is Zhuge Liang, who is the strategic genius, who's able to come up with these brilliant stratagems and have tremendous foresight and really able to see the future. Okay, so Zhuge Liang is almost the epitome, the paragon, the great genius of Chinese geopolitics. And then you have Cao Cao. Cao Cao is a very different person in that he's not really a geopolitical genius the way Zhuge Liang is, but he's very good at organization, about how to get people around him to love him, to support him, to follow him. Okay, so these are two maybe different types of archetypes of Chinese geniuses. For Thucydides, it doesn't matter. Who cares? Okay, what matters are these larger historical structural forces in play that drive nation states. So see history as maybe like these ocean waves. You're a great swimmer, but you're not going to beat an ocean wave. You know, if the ocean wave is coming, you can't swim against the current. And so what Thucydides argues is that what started the Peloponnesian War is not a conflict between individuals because, two people didn't like each other. The reason why is that Sparta was the dominant power and Athens was the emerging power. And so eventually Sparta saw Athens as a threat and therefore they had to go to war against each other. And this is a historical inevitability, a reality that no one can really avoid. So we focus a lot on Donald Trump, and everyone's like, why did Donald Trump start this war? And for Thucydides, this is like the wrong question. Who cares about Donald Trump? Who cares who the president of the United States is? This is a much better explanation for how this war started. This is called the Heartland Thesis by Harold Mackinder. Okay, and this is Anglo-American empire grand strategy, where they believe that the British and the Americans are ultimately a naval power. They don't have the manpower to fight a land war in Asia. And for them, the greatest threat is that a major land power would emerge in Europe or in Asia to unify the Eurasian heartland, what they call the world island, okay? So you might know something called a pivot area. This is what's crucial. Whoever controls this area is able to control all trade through Africa, Europe, Asia. And so the grand strategy of the Anglo-American empire is to make sure that no power ever rises to control the pivot area. And that's why we had World War I and World War II, because there's a real fear among the English and the Americans that Germany would actually unify the heartland. Okay. Now, why is this important? This is important because in 2022, Russia invaded Ukraine. And with that, now that the war is going well for Russia, there's a real threat that Russia unifies the heartland. And so what America needs to do is attack Iran. Okay, you need to split the heartland in half. Because if Russia and Iran were to unify, then the entire Eurasian continent would unify, okay? And that's what Thucydides would say is the real cause of this war. Not actors, not geniuses, but historical forces, okay? So there is an individual named Alexander Dugin. And I think he's actually the best geopolitical analyst we have today. He's Russian, and he may not have read Thucydides, but he definitely understands Thucydides better than any other geopolitical analyst today. His best book is this book called Foundations of Geopolitics, published in 1996. And in it, he presents a grand strategy for Russia. It's called the Third Rome, okay? And for him, he believes that first of all, he believes that geopolitical events will churn out in a certain way. And if Russia is able to position itself properly, then it will dominate the world, okay? So again, grand strategy, it's not about how to conquer the world. It's really about understanding the dynamics that control the world that move the world and position your nation in a way that allows you to maximize your advantage in these larger geopolitical movements, okay, these larger structural historical forces that Thucydides talks about a lot in the Peloponnesian War. And I don't want to go too much into it, but what Alexander Dugin would argue is that different nation states have different psychologies, different personalities. And these personalities will lead you to disaster or triumph in different circumstances, right? So the Western societies, Europe, Western Europe, America, they're what we call Faustian. They strive, they are individualistic, they're materialistic. And in World War I and World War II, in this great struggle of nations, that's what motivated them to conquer the world. But eventually what happens if you are too consumeristic, if you're too individualistic, materialistic, is that you become consumed by decadence, by greed, by selfishness. And as a result, your society falls apart. And this is what Dugin predicts will happen in America, China, and Western Europe, okay? And that gives space for Moscow to present an alternative vision that is orthodox, that is much more collectivist, that is much more religious, spiritual. And what Russia should do is reach out to other nation states that share the similar outlook, which include Iran, Persia, which include India, which include Japan, and smaller places, right? So, so I'm not saying he's right, or I'm not saying he's wrong, but he's presenting a grand theory of the world, which allows Russia to behave in a certain way as to maximize its advantage. And Dugin is important because his thinking has had a major influence on Vladimir Putin. And a lot of people believe that it is actually Dugin's thinking that is driving Russia's war in Ukraine. Okay, so this is really important for us to understand because, China itself is heading into major headwinds. Okay, this war in Iran is terrible for China because China is so dependent on the global economy, especially stability and continuity in the global economy, because it depends on so many resources from overseas, and its main economy is based on exports. Okay, so I see China, certain conflicts arising in China and in East Asia that Chinese policymakers must deal with. There's a short-term conflict and there's a long-term conflict. Okay, so this is a map of the South China Sea. And this is a map of Chinese fishing in the South China Sea. A lot of people believe that Taiwan will be the flashpoint. I don't think so. I think that Chinese policymakers aren't interested in Taiwan. The problem, though, is the way that Chinese economy is headed and how Chinese policymakers don't really have the foresight to control economic events. So these Chinese fishermen, are acting independently. There's no state policy that says let's overfish the South China Sea, but there's a lot of them, and they are in fact overfishing in the South China Sea, which will eventually bring them in conflict with other nations in Southeast Asia. And it's really unclear what the stance of the Chinese government will be when, say, the Philippines, the Vietnamese, the Japanese start to arrest Chinese fishermen for fishing in international waters. Okay, but I think that's going to be a major flashpoint that Chinese policymakers need to think much more strategically about in the short term. In the long term, there's a much bigger problem which no one's discussing, which is a water issue. So this is a map of rivers in Southeast Asia. As you can see, there are not many rivers, and as you can see, all these rivers are flowing downstream from the Tibetan Plateau, which is what China controls. And historically, wars have been fought over resources, especially water. All right. So this is something that Chinese policymakers have never discussed. They might discuss it. I don't know. Okay. But I don't think they've discussed this. And it's important that they start looking at this issue. And what my argument to you is that, like, unless there's a grand strategy in place, unless you have a grand theory about how the world works, you really can't develop the proper strategies and responses to short-term crises. Okay, so I will leave you with three comments. The first is that ideas do matter. Ideas have consequences. Chinese policymakers tend to focus too much on economics, on material, on raw power, like weapon systems. It doesn't matter. What matters are ideas, because it's ideas that coordinate, that motivate a population into action. Okay, that's point one. Point two is that people say that geography is destiny, okay? And that is true to a certain degree. But I would say that grand strategy is actually more important than geography. Grand strategy is a response to the limitations of geography. And the third comment, and the most, I think, the most controversial is that unless you have a grand strategy, unless you have a theory of the world, you'll be used by those who do. You'll just be a pawn in the game. You yourself will not be a player in the game. Okay, so I know this was a lot to take in, but I look forward to your questions.
这样很感谢Professor Jiang 呢给我们讲解了那个状况了。这样从Professor Jiang 他讲解的，大家也可以看到他的角度呢是很多方面的，除了就是从学术的角度啦然后从国际博弈的角度啦，而且还有一些现在没有人留意到的，比如说他刚才讲 water resources 水资源，其实现在没有人留意到这个问题，但是以后往往这个就是战争的来源，所以他也从很多不同的角度跟我们分析这样也很感谢那一个Professor 这样我现在就开始问问题了这样就是有一些朋友有一些学生还有一些那个网友呢，他们已经有一些问题，就有一个就。他们就想问，主要就是两个方面了。第一个就是现在那个战争跟还有另外一个就是因为大家就是生活在中国嘛，然后想问一下以后中国的未来，就是两大类型的问题这样子。像第一个，他们就想问一下，现在其实如果看到那一个战争，其实是不太合理的，因为如果比如说伊朗呢，它主要攻击的地方呢，它主要攻击是 Tel Aviv，但是它是没有打 Jerusalem 的。像其实Jerusalem呢，才是他那个，比如说最高法院还是国会，就是在那边，就是讲会不会有一个情况，他们暂时不打，就是好像以前也提过的，会不会那个原因他们不打的原因是避免一个 false threat，就是为其行动，免得就是那个清真寺，他们就嫁祸给那一个伊朗，所以他们伊朗暂时就不动Jerusalem，是因为他们怕。给以色列作为一个 false flag?
Yeah, so that's a good point where there's been a lot of talk that the Israelis will use a false flag to destroy the Al-Aqsa Mosque, which will trigger a religious war in the Middle East. But actually, from a grand strategy perspective, what Iran is doing is actually very strategic. Okay, so if you just look at where Iran is focusing its fire, it's not in Israel. Because it doesn't matter. Like Israel is not the problem. Where Iran is focusing its fire is the UAE, because that's the most vulnerable. Okay, so it's asymmetrical warfare, meaning I have very limited weaponry, and I don't want to waste it. I need to be strategic in how I use it. And so what I'm trying to do is I'm trying to provoke a ground invasion, right? So what I do is I close off the Strait of Hormuz. I prevent maritime shipping, and I attack UAE because the UAE is actually the weakest link in this alliance in the Middle East. I don't care about Israel. Like my issue is not Israel. My issue is the United States. I need to force the United States into a ground invasion, and I need to defeat the United States on the ground. That's the only way I can beat them, right? So Jerusalem doesn't really matter. Tel Aviv that doesn't matter. It's attacking Israel is almost like high cost, low reward. What's the point, right? You're better off attacking the UAE, Bahrain, Saudi Arabia, because these GCC nations will force America into a ground invasion, which is what you want. Like that's the end game, right? You want to force that. And already there's reporting that MBS, who's head of Saudi Arabia, is actually the major figure in the Middle East lobbying Trump to launch a ground invasion. Netanyahu himself is he wants a ground invasion as well. So the Israel game plan is to have United States and Iran destroy each other, in which case Israel emerges as the top dog. And Iran has to lure the United States into this ground invasion and destroy the United States on the ground. Okay, so in other words, Israel and Iran are actually not enemies. In game theory, in grand strategy, they're actually working together in order to destroy the American empire together.
谢谢Professor Jiang。这样另外还有个问题呢，就是按照有一些人秘密组织，他们对以后的那个 plan 啊，就是 secret society，然后他们讲呢，如果有World War III 的话呢，然后他们讲以色列跟伊朗他们会有一个 nuclear exchange 这样你认为他们执行这个计划大吗？那个几率？
Okay, so I want to clarify something about secret societies. So there's perception that secret societies are the ones who control everything, and that's not true. What secret societies do is they're interested in maintaining power in a time of political change. And so secret societies have knowledge and information that most people don't. They have histories going back thousands of years. And so they know how things develop, and they know that this is the time of decline of empire. And so America will do stupid things as it declines. For example, start this war in the Middle East. So what they want to do is they want to accelerate events so that they maximize their benefit. They can't stop things from happening. What they can do is move things faster so that they are able to basically play the market properly, right? To gain advantage. So these secret societies know that what will happen is the United States will lose this war in Iran. The United States is forced back into America, and a civil war starts in America. Israel will emerge as a dominant power in the Middle East. And eventually what will happen is that Israel will come into conflict with Iran, which may be like 10, 20 years down the road, right? Because Iran still has to rebuild. But not only that, but Russia will eventually come into this war as well. It's something that they call the War of Gog and Magog. And so rather than think that they are scripting this out, it's better to say that they understand the cycles of history, how empires behave, how wars in the Middle East start and develop. And so they're trying to manage this, okay? But the specific question, will nuclear weapons be used? No, they won't be used because it's not in the best interest of anyone for nuclear weapons to be used, right? So nuclear weapons is, again, you have to think in terms of like personality and worldview and grand strategy. Does it make sense for nuclear weapons to be used in any wars?
这样另外就想问一下呢，就是以前那个美国一个将军呢，就是 Pike，Pike，他那时候他就讲过呢，就是有一个 letter， 他那时候他们提出呢，就是如果发动第三次世界大战那时候的话呢，两边第一方面就是美国跟以色列的那一边呢 ，Zionist， 另外那一边呢就是 Islam country， 他们会打到 complete exhaustion 的。所以如果他们讲的东西是没有错的话呢，这样未来的话那个战争可能会升级哦。你认为未来的战争会很快结束，还是按照他们的计划打到两败俱伤 ，completely exhaust for both parties?
Right. So the person you're referring to is Albert Pike, and he's like the grand architect of Freemasonry in America. It's the Freemasons that actually control America, the national security apparatus. And he wrote a book called Morals and Dogma. Okay, so that Morals and Dogma is the book you want to read. The letter about World War I, World War II, World War III, it's actually fake. It's not real. It's a fabricated document. So the idea that World War III will usher in one world government. The Christians and the Muslims will destroy each other, allowing the Jews to rule the world. That is not a real document. But you know, Morrison Dogma, which is the book he wrote, that is a real book, and it's about 1,000 pages, and I've read it. Okay, and you read it, what you will see is that these people, these secret societies, for them, it's not about world conquest. It's really about bringing reason and order to the world, making the world a better place. Because for them, the main problem is that humans have too much agency. There's too much diversity. There's too much conflict, right? So what you do is you can create a system in which case everyone is happy and everyone is obedient, and that will create a perfect world. And the mechanism that they want to use to create this is artificial intelligence. Okay, that's why we're seeing a rollout of AI everywhere. Even though from an economic perspective, it actually doesn't make any sense, right? But from a control perspective, it does make a lot of sense. So the real goal here is to create so much chaos, and then after the chaos, then you can actually create an AI surveillance state, a control grid, which by the way, China already has.
另外想问一下呢，就是那一个有人就问呢，就是那个在中东那个地方啊，基本上中东地方呢，就是那个 crypto Jews 跟 Sabata Frankens 他们控制的嘛。这样未来的话呢，这样他们那个走向，尤其是那个海湾国家，他们还不会按照美国的东西了，因为如果他们是 crypto Jews 或者是 Sabata Frankens，他们就是会按照美国的嘛。这样所以如果未来有战争，是不是他们会选边站，全部站在美国那一边？
Yeah, so this is really important idea to understand, like the crypto Jews, right? So if you look at Saudi Arabia, it's run by crypto Jew Septine Francus. And Iran actually understands this. And that's why the grand strategy of Iran is actually to create eternal conflict within these nations, right? To overthrow the ruling elites who are loyal to the Anglo-American Empire, right? So the Saudi royal family was put in place by the British. And the Saudi Arabia, the British picked these crypto Jews, these 17 Francus, because they knew that they had to be loyal to the British Empire because they didn't have popular support, right? So we're seeing the end of the British idea of the Middle East. The GCC will not survive this. These royal families will not survive this war.
这样另外，那时候也看过，刚才你也讲 Secret Society 啊，那时候就看到你也有视频，也有讲过，在其他 interview 那边也有讲过，就是你讲 Illuminati 有3个 component，其实 Secret Society 有很多啊，但是为什么你那时候讲这3个是最重要的？
Right. So you're right in that there are many different aspects to the Illuminati, okay? But I mentioned these 3 because what happened at the end of the 18th century. So the Illuminati was started by 3 individuals, okay? The first, his name is Jacob Frank, who is the head of the 17 Francus. He's considered the messiah to these people, okay? Jacob Frank. And then he was good friends with Mayer Rothschild of the Rothschild banking family, right? And so it was Rothschild who financed the founding of the Illuminati. And the third person who's the most important is Adam Weishaupt. And he's a Jesuit. He's actually a crypto Jew. So the Jesuits were founded by crypto Jews. So they were always embedded within the Catholic Church. And it's really the Jesuits who control the Vatican, right? So it's these 3 individuals that are key.
你认为这3个Secret Society 在以后那个战争啊，或者以后他们会扩大那个战争，那时候会发挥什么影响啊？
Right. So again, these secret societies, first of all, they want to maintain their power and their influence. And so they have access to like thousands and thousands of years of human history, and they're able to figure out certain patterns to it. It's almost like astrology, right? It's like reading the stars. Well, if you read the stars, you can also read human history. So they want to prepare and manipulate events so that they benefit from this war in the Middle East. And then they understand the power of religion, how religion can motivate their followers into certain actions. And so the people in charge don't care about anything. All they care about is maintaining their power. But the followers, so people call the Christian Zionists, they really do believe that this war will usher in the coming of the Messiah or the return of Jesus. Okay, so these are the powerful people manipulating events, but they understand, like, to manipulate things properly, you need to tell a story to your followers that motivates them into action.
嗯，好，感谢。这样我们问完了那一笔那个 Middle East，这样我们可以回来还有一个问题这个可能也跟 Middle East 有关。然后问完这个，我们就讲回亚洲。这个为什么跟那一个Middle East 有关呢？因为在中东有两个很大的海峡嘛，一个已经给那一个伊朗他已经封锁了，另外还有一个呢，就是在也门那一边呢，他们有那个曼德海峡，然后呢，他因为那个胡塞武装呢，他们已经讲他们也会参战，所以如果两个海峡就是封掉的话呢，这样在Saudi Arabia 那个油啊，它现在那个油它还可以靠东西油管经过红海，去那一个也门那边出来，这样就出不了来。如果碰到这种情况的话呢，日本的话，因为日本是最没有任何来源的嘛，日本会怎么样处理呢？会不会挑起一个战争？我想问一下。
Right. So it seems very likely that both the Red Sea and the Strait of Hormuz will be closed off because the Houthis have entered the war. And the Houthis, they are able to strike both the Red Sea as well as the oil fields of Saudi Arabia. So even if they don't actually close off the two straits, they're still able to hit the energy infrastructure of Saudi Arabia and other GCC nations. And you're right in that Japan is actually suffering a great deal right now. So Philippines have declared a state of emergency. Vietnam, Thailand have gone to fuel rationing, and they are trying to reduce as much fuel dependence as possible. And Japan, which is the most industrial economy in East Asia, they will run out of oil. They have oil reserves, but they'll run out in about 7 to 8 months. Okay, so they need to act now. And so what I think will happen is that Japan will be forced to remilitarize. They will have to send their navy and be part of this coalition, an alliance. And South Korea will have to participate as well. But before then, I think Japan will try to bribe the Iranians. But the way that the war is heading, it seems as though Japan will ultimately remilitarize and send a force to the Middle East. But that's probably a year away.
其实我也同意你讲啊，因为如果日本他们派那个军队去护航啊，或者去做那一个军事行动的话，他们也可以取消他们那个限定，因为他们现在是自卫队，所以如果有那个 law 通过的话呢，他们以后就更容易。
That is the plan. Yes, yes,
但是
exactly.
如果会这样的话，会不会跟中国有冲突呢？因为你可以看到那个军国主义的话，在那一个日本也影响了很多。其实安倍死那时候呢是很多漏洞的，安倍给人暗杀那一个，他死了以后，你可以看到那一个立刻往右转了很多，所以你可以看到那一个高市早苗啊，还有前阵子就是他那个军官进去了那个大使馆，有很多这种事情，这样中越会爆发战争吗？
Look, the reality is that China and Japan have two different military doctrines. China is a land army. That's where its strength is. China is focused first and foremost on protecting its borders. Japan is an aggressive naval power. It probably has the world's greatest navy right now. I mean, if the United States and Japan were to go to war, Japan, it was just a maritime battle. No airplanes could be used. Japan would win. And so Japan understands this. And so if Japan were to remilitarize, if it were to use this war in Iran to be more aggressive, there's very little China can do about it. I mean that's the reality. I mean, that's why I say grand strategy is very important, because China should have anticipated that this would happen eventually, where the United States withdraws from East Asia and Japan becomes much more militaristic, much more aggressive. In which case, how do you defend against this sort of aggression? Because remember, the seas, who controls the seas in South China Sea? For Japan, it's a matter of life and death. China doesn't really care. It's like, fine, I retreat back into my borders. I don't allow my people to fish anymore. Who cares, right? But for Japan, it's a matter of life and death.
如果那个日本是一个 matter of life and death 的话，而且以前是没有一个很紧迫的事情，现在如果他们那个游不到的话呢，他们对以后他们的经济发展啊、工业啊，全部会有问题。这样那个时间点挑战中国的时间点，会不会就是因为中东的战争很快出现呢？就是1-2年内 I mean.
Look, I think you're right in that Japan wants to use this war in the Middle East as an excuse to remilitarize, okay? But Japan actually has the resources to buy oil from both Russia and the United States, okay? So I mean, like, the United States would be perfectly happy to supply Japan with oil as well as Russia. So Japan is not really under threat, but it has to change its military doctrine. It has to change its relationship with Russia and the United States.
这样我想问一下，除了日本以外，然后台湾地区是我们自己国家，这样这个就不谈了。但是还有2个比较 hotspot， 一个是菲律宾，然后一个是北韩。你怎么样看呢？那2个会不会影响到以后中国的发展呢？还有机会有开战呢？Right.
So if I'm North Korea, okay, I'm just saying this from a grand strategy perspective. If I'm North Korea, now is the best opportunity to create as much problems for East Asia as possible. 1, because everyone's distracted in the war in Iran. 2, because I have a mutual defense pact with Russia, right? So if I'm attacked, Russia comes to my aid. And 3 is that I don't even have to go to war. All I have to do is threaten South Korea or Japan, and they'll bribe me not to do anything, okay? Because, like, again, South Korea and Japan, their priority is to get resources for their economy. They don't have time to deal with North Korea. So if I'm North Korea right now, I'm like, I'm going to start, causing a lot of problems. I'm going to start, doing missile tests. I'm going to start threatening Seoul. I'm going to dispatch my navy to come to conflict with Japan, right? Create as much aggression as possible, in which case Japan and South Korea are forced to pay you off, to bribe you, okay? Philippines, I'm not sure what the issue with the Philippines is. They'll come to conflict with China, but it will be part of a much more larger Southeast Asia alliance. Vietnam and Philippines and Malaysia, Indonesia, they all have grievances with China, right? So be part of a Southeast Asia alliance against China.
这样，其实很多人说就是现在亚洲就是中国跟其他那些东亚的国家有不和的背后的原因，就是其实在美国在后面呢。但是如果按照我们长期来讲，因为中国已经是美国的唯一的竞争对手，俄罗斯他们已经不考虑了。所以如果碰到这种情况的话，中美以后长期来讲或者短期来讲，有没有机会还好像以前这么好呢？还是已经没办法好了？已经一定要打，看谁赢。打就不一定是 military 的，可能在经济上真的要只有一个人站，一个人跌下来才可以完成，还是还有和解的空间呢？
I'm just speaking from American grand strategy, okay? Look, the reality is that America is going to lose this war in the Middle East, in which case it no longer has access to GCC. It's very important because GCC provides a lot of funding for the economy, right? So the GCC sells its oil and then recycles these petrodollars back into the American economy. So now I need to transition my economy from one that is focused on finance, on basically manipulation of the stock market, to one that is more based on selling resources to the rest of the world, right? So if I'm America and I see Japan and China fighting, if I see China and Southeast Asia fighting, I am laughing my head off because I can sell oil, I can sell resources, and I can sell weapons to both Japan and China. And I want to encourage this conflict as much as possible. Okay. So we're seeing a shift from American grand strategy from one of, like I want to maintain the Pax Americana. I want to maintain globalization because because then I can make money off finance in the US dollar, right? Because when you trade, you do so in US dollar. So I can take a cut to one like, you know what? I'm going to retreat back into the Western Hemisphere. No one can attack me. So all I have to do is sell my resources, my oil, my rare earths, my agricultural products to everyone else, which is probably East Asia, Japan and China specifically. All right. So China and America will be good friends because there's really no conflict. Okay. The conflict is really between Japan and China.
哦，所以还是可以 under control。这样，另外想请教一下，就是Professor Jiang，你认为未来的那一个中国啊，在那一个整个的未来的发展跟世界领导的地位，会不会取代美国？如果不能够的话，是不是就是激突以后的世界格局，长期10年内
？Look, I always say this, but the best indicator of the future is the past. Was there ever a time in history when China was concerned about the world, when China actually explored and conquered different parts of the world? And the answer is it's not. And the reason why is it's because it's 中国, the Middle Kingdom. I don't care about the rest of the world, right? So there's no grand strategy. There's no geopolitical strategy of how to exert influence around the world. Belt and Road initiative doesn't really have a strategy behind it. It's just like, let's just trade. But it's built on top of the American system, right? So you don't have Belt and Road if Pax Americana is still around. But what happens when Pax Americana implodes and then you have piracy, you have conflict everywhere? Well, Belt and Road doesn't work anymore, right? Either that or you send your military overseas, which China's not going to do, right? The reality is, and I keep on saying this, is that without a grand strategy, without a theory of the world, there's very little you can do. You can't really participate in the world. So historically, whenever there's been global conflict, what China has always done is turtle up, retreat back into its borders, and then close its borders. Like we can't trade with the world, fine, we'll just close up, and then protect our borders. And that's what I think China will most likely do in the future.
不好意思，想问一下，刚才那个你就是预期中国它是 best strategy for him 啊，但是想问一下，这样如果你可以设定一个 grand policy， 这样你认为什么 grand policy 是 to the best interest of 中国呢？有哪一个？如果你可以制定计划的话，你建议是怎样走呢？
I can't answer that because China's not interested in the world. I mean, like China doesn't have any friends. Okay, like North Korea is an ally of China, but are they friends? So you look at the Russians, you look at the Japanese, you look at the Americans, the British. They're presenting a grand theory of the world, and they build alliances. Okay, so China just doesn't care. I mean, like these Chinese policymakers, these Chinese leaders don't care. So they don't care. What's the point of like developing a grand strategy?
好的，这样看一下有没有其他朋友有问题啊？如果你们有问题呢，可以在 chat box 那边呢打进来，我们 accept 1到2条的问题。有兴趣问Professor Jiang 的老师啊、同学或者是外面的朋友啊，也可以看一下。正在他们等问题，那时候也不要浪费时间，反正就是我们还有2分钟，我也想问一下 Professor Jiang，这样你认为未来就是2年内整个中东那个面貌，那个 Greater Israel 大以色列会不会出现呢？真的按照他们的计划，还是不一定能够成功呢？这样那时候如果成功的话，伊朗它会不会还在存在？另外那些海湾国家，刚才你讲过海湾国家应该是没有了，这样是不是只是剩下 Great Israel 还有那一个伊朗呢？
So I think next 2 years, things will reach an equilibrium, okay? Meaning that this war doesn't end, but America is sending ground troops. And the economies of the GCC have been destroyed. But this war just drags on. And there's no resolution to this war. And then what's going to happen is you're going to see massive discontent in the United States. You're going to see the uprising. A lot depends on what happens in 2028 when Donald Trump is supposed to leave office. He's not going to leave office. I mean, like you just look at his past behavior, like he wants a third term, right? So I think what's going to happen over the next 2 years is this conflict in the Middle East is going to start shifting back into North America. And also, like, people don't appreciate this, but just because America is losing this war in the Middle East doesn't mean it will not go invade Cuba. It won't invade Canada, Mexico. I mean, this is an American empire, and if it's losing in Iran, it's going to shift attention and start focusing on North America. And Peter Hegseth, the Secretary of War, has already said this, where we see North America as part of America's security perimeter. Meaning like we control North America. And if you don't obey us, we'll come attack you. Okay, so it's possible in the next 2 years, this war in the Middle East continues, but there's other conflicts elsewhere. What I see long term happening is that America will recognize that it will lose this war in the Middle East, and what will happen is you will see a shifting of military resources to Israel, where American military equipment, American military resources, personnel is being shifted into Israel so that Israel becomes the Greater Israel Project, right? Because the moment that America is defeated, the moment America leaves the Middle East, then Israel absorbs all CENTCOM, all of the American military apparatus in the Middle East, and it achieves the Greater Israel Project. And by then, the GCC will have been destroyed, Iran will have been crippled, and there'll be absolutely no opposition to Israel.
OK，这样，因为我们 over 问一点点啊，问多一条问题啊，不好意思。这样，因为有提问的朋友就比较多，这样我们提问一条吧。就是从其他资料那边也有看到呢，就是讲呢，他们其实美国他们自己有个计划呢，他是自己破坏自己的，从内部开始破坏自己，这样可能有 econ 跟 finance 的考虑了，因为它可以再出美元啊，还有其他东西。但是你认为美国大乱的几率高不高呢？如果这个战争，好像你刚才去讲的去进展，然后美国会不会？刚才你讲有 uprising 啦 ，uprising 到哪个程度呢？是它会不会 divide into 不同的州呢？这样的 conflict。
Right. So you really want to understand this war. What you need to appreciate is that there's already a civil war going on in America. Okay, the people with the power are Wall Street, and they've created a financialized economy, and they've been in power since Clinton and Obama. Okay. And what Trump is representing are people called the counter elites, these revolutionaries who want to shift power from the financial elite to Silicon Valley, artificial intelligence. Okay, so now there are two major bubbles in America. There's a private credit bubble, about $2 trillion, where these private companies lend money to other companies, and like it's a bubble, like they're all bankrupt. Okay, but you also have the AI bubble, where these 7 companies control the entire AI. It doesn't make any money. They're all bubbles, okay? Now, whoever the elite is able to control and direct government policy, right? So basically, who bails out who, right? So if in the current system, what will happen is that Washington will bail out the financial elite. But if Trump is able to succeed and amass more power for himself, then Washington will bail out the AI people. Okay, so there's a civil war going on in America, and that's why we're seeing a lot of international conflict. Because from Trump's perspective, it's good that you start wars, because when you start these wars, what you're doing is you're actually weakening the military-industrial complex. You're actually weakening the financial sector, and that makes them vulnerable to a counter revolution, okay? The AI people, okay? And eventually what's going to happen is that the financial people are going to strike back, and then they're going to find a point of conflict where the different militias, the different groups are then fight on the streets, okay? And so if you just see the world through that lens, okay? The civil war going on in America between Wall Street and Silicon Valley, where Wall Street is the old money and they control that government, and Silicon Valley is this new money that seeks to control government, then a lot of things make more sense, especially if you just see everything from that lens, okay? What happened in Venezuela, what's happening in Iran, what's going to happen in North America, what's happening in China. This makes a lot more sense.
好，这样今天非常多谢Professor Jiang 的分享了哈，也很多谢了各位参加今天我们讲座的老师学生还有那个外面的朋友。希望你们可以以后继续留意我们香港恒生大学主办的讲座啦。所有这些讲座呢，我们也会放在那个相关的频道请大家留意。再次谢谢 Professor Jiang，希望以后你可以再给我们大学继续做讲座，谢谢你。
谢谢。